Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and it is really a great pleasure for me to be here. I should say for the background that my wife and I were here for an environmental event, 2009. And by chance and accident, and in the process, I think we lost our passport and the bags and a few other things, not because of what happened here, because of us. We ended up spending a bit more time, and we've been very happy about that mistake, because now we have our own place here and plan to spend here maybe 3 to 4 months per year. We fell in love with the country and with the people, and also saw a lot of potential that many people still don't seem to find here. And I think part of the reason may be that the assets that the country has are only beginning to be communicated internationally. Already quite a few things was mentioned about my background. I would just mention things that are relevant to the presentation. There's a reason why I call this group, decided to have a title or name, Difference Group. And that's because I'm personally more and more concerned, the more and more I see that without inclusive growth, having just growth, for sheer growth, but not inclusive growth, we are actually creating same solutions that have operated in perhaps advanced economies and trying to impose them onto emerging and transitional economies. And some of you may know that there's a whole philosophical tradition behind thinking this way, coming from the French deconstructionist Jacques Derrida about the role of difference and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with philosophy here right now, but I do want to mention that I take it very seriously. I take it very seriously because since I tend to focus on multipolarity and multipolar economies, the values and interests that I focus on are not those of advanced economies only, G7, but nor are they those of only the BRICS or the large emerging economies. I would pride myself if I ever succeeded to talk about both. And that's hard because there are real conflicts, there are real frictions in this regard between advanced and emerging economies, within emerging economies, within advanced economies, and I unfortunately think that we will have more of those. And it will get worse before it will get any better. What makes the approach perhaps different, and it will be reflected by what I will say next. Unfortunately, I can't give out the handout of the presentation itself, but I will give out commentaries based on the points that I will make. And they will be available to you or from the website, whichever way you see best after the presentation. In the difference group, and prior to that, I focused on both economic and non-economic growth. I've never believed the idea that growth is only an economic thing. I've always thought, like Gunnar Myrdal and a lot of development economists with a long tradition, that this is a very holistic thing. And if you ignore one part of it, you may have serious issues. The second point that makes perhaps this approach slightly different is the one I already mentioned. We focus on both advanced and emerging economies. If you advocate solutions that have worked in advanced economies to the emerging economies, irrespective of their culture, their context, their history, you may have the best of intentions, but you may be paving the way to hell, to a nightmare. That concerns a lot of ideas and notions, and I'll come back to those. It is very important to differentiate these kind of solutions approaches. Thirdly, there's a focus on future-driven multipolar scenarios. What I mean by that is that if you're in business, and especially come from New York City, where I've spent a lot of my time, I grew up in Europe, then went to the US with my Fulbright and sort of extended my stay. And then the past 10 years, I have spent more and more time in China and emerging Asia. And now the past 5 years, more and more, it seems, in the Philippines. What concerns me is that if you live with the Wall Street, or you take that pace of life as reality, your lifespan is 1 quarter. That's it. 1 quarter. If you're a hedge fund player, perhaps 1 or 2 days. That may already be too long. In my position, I like to look at medium and long term, because I think that the problems we're dealing with are medium and long term by nature, so you will not resolve them by a short-term focus. So these 3 aspects are really the differences that characterize the difference group. And it started from my activity around 2008-2009. If you remember that terrible beginning of the crisis, the collapse and so on and so forth, at the time many people thought that in a year or two we'll be back to business, and I argued against it. Wherever I was, in New York City, in Singapore, elsewhere, no, this is not going to happen. But the worst of all is when 2009 in February I argued that the United States, the employment rate, will not get back to pre-crisis level until around 2015. People were pretty much laughing at the time. Nobody could believe that. Everybody thought that maybe unemployment rate would go 10%, but then soon it would come back. It was a V recession, quickly back, like Reagan era. Didn't happen. And I think that we're dealing with something that hasn't even shown its true nature quite as yet. So these kind of predictions are based on the approach I mentioned, the general guidelines, the general outline of that approach. And if you take seriously, for instance, the idea that let's say fair market thinking or very statistic or statist thinking is the way out from this crisis, I think in both cases you are in for some negative surprises. I think that the problems we're dealing are far more complex. You will find more material if needed from the website differencegroup.net. There are two slides I'd like to use and I've been using since around 2007 because I think that they tell us a lot about the crisis we're dealing with. One has to do with the nature of the transition. I think that since 2008, de facto, we're dealing with a structural transition more and more. This is a famous issue of the rise of the BRICS by Jim O'Neill, who used to work for Goldman Sachs. And his idea was that actually the role of the BRICS will become more and more important in the world. And now we kind of have forgotten all about it because there is this idea that actually the BRICS are gone, forget them, emerging markets, who cares, the money is not there, the money is back in the advanced economies. I think that's a terrible fallacy, and I will come back to this. But the simple reality is that what we have learned really in the past half decade is that the road, the path from the present to the future will be far more complicated than we thought. And if you take approaches, policy stances that focus on something else than economic development, one might argue the Russian example, the focus on geopolitics, whether it's necessary or not, that distracts you from economic development. China is desperately trying, according to its own words, to focus on economic development. And even in China, it's getting to be pretty tough. I just published a longer commentary on Brazil, which is not the subject today, but I will give you information about. That is a very intriguing example of what has happened there. 5-10 years ago, it was the model of how to do things, how to grow fast if we have a big population. Cash transfers that were initiated there, prior to President Lula, already under President Cardoso, and which has given a lot of lessons, I believe, also here. What can he do? And now, under Dilma Rousseff, entirely different scene, partly because of policy mistakes, partly because of far more challenging environment. So I argue that this structural transition has not gone anywhere. It's still with us. The other part of the crisis that we're dealing with has to do with business cycles. And all I want to emphasize here, as I've done in the past half decade, that when this crisis took place, and we saw this deep plunge, deep contraction across the world, there were a couple of areas where it never was negative, although the pattern was a collapse. Africa, not negative. But the problem is that Africa is far more differentiated. It's a continent and you have different kind of countries. And what makes it difficult, even more difficult and complex, is that some are oil exporters, energy exporters, others are not. One area that I advise is Nigeria. Everybody, including Jim O'Neill, wrongly, I thought, saw Nigeria as the sort of harbinger of the future. I have the greatest respect for the country and its leaders and its people, but I thought that they will have problems. And the reason is that when 95% of your exports are in energy, and 60% perhaps of your government revenues are based on this, well, as long as the oil price is high, you're doing fine. But when it's not, you are dealing with serious issues. And that's where we are. In addition to security issues related with Boko Haram. So Africa is one example. Another example was Middle East. Again, not a very homogeneous continent. You have very different kind of countries. And there too we've seen what can happen and how things can go wrong and how hard it is to sustain growth. But most importantly, emerging Asia. I've argued now for half a decade that even though there was the same pattern of collapse, it was never negative. And that has great bearing in terms of the potential for the future. But even if you have the greatest potential for the future, but you do not use policies to realize the potential, you will be lost in this kind of international environment. A simple example, totally from a different area. Every time I've been here the past 5 years, and I'm sure in the next 5 years, people will tell me that Philippines is a wonderful demographic sweet spot, and I couldn't agree more. Youthful population, big population, rapidly growing, greater prosperity per capita, and so on and so forth. But think of other countries. Think of Brazil, think of Iran or Egypt. Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1960s had a socialist government, secular, progressive, forward-looking, and people came from the countryside looking for jobs. Ultimately, they could not find them. The same thing happened in Brazil. People came from the countryside looking for the jobs. They ended up in the favelas. And President Lula spent most of his time trying to unravel the foundations of those favelas. So even if you have the best potential, but you don't have the right policies, you will either end up having slums or all kinds of social dislocations, or even violence, as we've seen in the Middle East. So good potential requires the right policies. Now, during this crisis, and I won't spend time talking about it too much, I will only use a few slides that I've got. I will only argue as a kind of a conclusion of my arguments. I'll be glad to talk about this in the future. Many people argue what were the reasons for this recession. I would pay more attention to what happened during and after this recession. When it started, most of the debt that existed was in the private sector. About, according to this is from McKinsey, around 2007 in the fourth quarter, around $158 trillion, and less of it in the public sector. Now, half a decade later, we find to our great surprise, despite all the rhetoric of deleveraging, that actually public sector is carrying now most of that debt. Private sector is not. And that means the taxpayers ultimately will have to pay for it. So the financial sector did something very much right for its own good, because they socialized risk when it was in their interest to do so, and they didn't carry the responsibilities. This, I think, is a serious issue that will be faced for years to come, in addition to the structural problems of aging populations in the West and so on and so forth. Now, if the situation is potentially so full of moral hazards, all kinds of challenges, why is it that we have the semblance of stability? For the past 5 years, I've argued that the stock market valuations that we have, a lot of things that we have that to maintain that sense of stability, may be elusive. It's not that they aren't right. They're right as long as we believe in the value of these things. But what if we're dealing with emperor's clothes? It has happened before in the history. But there's a real reason why we have this semblance of stability. I would argue it has a lot to do with monetary injections in the West. First by the Federal Reserve in the United States, then by European Central Bank, and then Bank of Japan, which actually started this process years before. And this has continued. Quite a lot of money has been spent in the quantitative easing policies that are different in different countries and regions, but the objectives are pretty much the same. And the same goes for the record low interest rates. So when people say that actually we're not doing that bad, that worse, keep in mind that we're really using a sort of supplementary lungs right now to breathe. And that has to do with these monetary injections. One question that pains me constantly: what happens if we have a global recession? In the past, it was easy. The interest rates were high, so you cut them down, and thereby support the economies in their efforts to overcome problems. What are we going to do now? They are already down. We've been engaging in quantitative easing, and they're not only down in one continent, they are down in 3. And as China is slowing down a bit with its reforms, it also is taking a bit of that road, more cautiously while engaged in leveraging, but nonetheless. So this is an extremely complicated and dangerous situation as far as I would argue. What are its implications in terms of Philippines? When you look at the situation in Philippines and you look at its growth and inflation in the past 5 years, current account balance, foreign reserves, and public external debt as here, it all looks pretty nice. This is from IMF, the latest study, I believe, last year. It all looks pretty good. I think there's a reason to be proud of the achievements of the past few years. But the question is, can they continue? And if so, to what degree? When the world is changing around us. So I would argue that these numbers might look even stronger under some circumstances, but they are not immune to global headwinds, especially today. So how should you look at those so-called global headwinds? I simply did, for the purpose of this presentation, a simple exercise. I looked at the main spillover channels: trade, foreign direct investment, remittances, and global financial uncertainty or financial sector. And then looked at what are the key countries in all of those areas. Key countries meaning that they account for 75% of that trade. So if you look at trade channels, where does 75% of the trade go? What does it have to do with? There we have Japan, US, China, Singapore, Germany, Korea, Thailand. As long as those countries are doing reasonably well. Philippines might do reasonably well, but what if they don't? FDI, the same: Netherlands, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. Remittances: US, Saudi Arabia, UAE, UK, Singapore, Japan. And then the short-term stresses that follow accordingly, depending on the nature of the international environment. And looking particularly then how they might translate to into the financial sector. What might it mean? One very simple example that people, of course, like to use is the Philippine peso. Now, I've been very impressed by that. When I look, for instance, at ringgit, the past few months, past year or so, terrible. If you are a senior executive or you're a government policymaker and you took debt, and you took a lot of debt a couple of years back, and it is in dollars, good luck. It is a very challenging situation now. I warned about this, I think, in Shanghai Daily already 2 years ago, because it was easy to see that dollar-denominated debt would be a serious problem when we would see the reversal of the US Fed policies. And a lot of people thought, well, I can deal with it. It will take time before Fed will start reversing its policy, and it took a while. But actually their fiscal balance deteriorated in the meanwhile. Taking into consideration the circumstances, I would argue that Philippine peso has done very well until now. But I would also argue that history in these circumstances is not a guideline for the future. We are dealing with something where historical examples may be irrelevant, meaningless. The value may be zilch. Because when situations change internationally, it's natural that we use a rear window to see where we're going. But try to take your car out from a parking garage looking at the rear window and you're in trouble because you will take the wrong path. And here it's a bit the same. You have to look into the past. You have to look forward in the short term as policymakers and senior executives do. And then, like some of us, including myself, you also try to look into medium term and long term, see what is the potential. And even if things look good, does it mean that we really realize all the potential that we have? Or are we ignoring or untapping some of those areas? A few examples very quickly of the diminished growth drivers internationally. Then I will mention what I consider to be the top 8 global economic themes. My attention is not to emulate David Letterman when he used to have his show, but this is an easy way to quickly give you an idea of some of the points that I might make. And then the few regional economic themes as well, and about the future. US. A couple of years back, many people said, particularly in the US and elsewhere, that things will just get better. Back to business. America is back. We hear that also in the Trump campaign. We hear it in many campaigns nowadays. Every time somebody says that the great days of America are coming back, watch your wallet, because they're not. It doesn't mean that America has lost its significance. On the contrary, I think that it's a very powerful nation and it will do better than all advanced economies during and after this crisis if it keeps its doors open for immigration. The moment it closes those doors, growth will be cut, productivity levels will plunge. What we see in the US, though, is that the strong recovery many thought would ensue is not happening. A month ago, I talked about lingering recovery. Now I like to talk about weakening recovery with downside risks. 5 years ago, I learned something that I would recommend to everybody, even though it sounds a bit cynical. Whenever you read IMF's projections or World Bank's, ignore the upside potential. Look at the downside risks. The upside hasn't happened. Every time when you look at those projections, only the negatives sort of are in spotlight. Nonetheless, the short-term growth, I do believe, is going to be maybe 1.5%, 2% at the beginning of this year. Medium term could rise to 2.6% by 2018, assuming that the risks will be overcome, but will then decelerate to about 2% plus by early 2020s. Think about this. When I grew up in the late 60s, 70s, I remember the time when Italy was growing 5 to 7% in early 60s. And we may think that, well, that was terrible time, a lot of construction modernization, but hey, that was Federico Fellini. That was the Italian cultural renaissance. Sometimes when the growth is high, it is not mutually exclusive to a lot of other things. That was a time when the Western Europe was growing. And this may sound very low compared to what it has been with the US in the past, but it's hell of a lot better than many other countries. My biggest problem is with this. It happens not only with the monetary injections, but the burden of public debt. And more importantly, we're talking about a burden where there's no credible bipartisan medium-term debt plan. None. In 2011, if you remember, there was a very bad crisis in August. There was a lot of talk, a lot of crying, and a lot of blaming. And people were terrified because the US debt was too high. At the time, it was $11 trillion. Well, now it's 18. And like the Energizer Bunny, it keeps going up. And what it means right now is that it's about 104% of the GDP. The total debt, sovereign, private, etc., is about $65 trillion. Total interest, about $2.4 trillion, which is more than three largest budget items, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense together. Total debt per citizen, $200,000. Total debt per family, $79,500. Savings per family, $9,000. This is not the economy that was so strong after the Second World War. It is stumbling along, and that's why I call the growth weakening and elusive. And it pains me, because if you talk with ordinary New Yorkers, at least where I come from, and you ask, will your children do better than you? You will not find very often an answer that they will say, of course they will do better, which was a standard answer in the 1950s. Nobody would have any doubts that kids will do better than they once did. Then the politics. Will things change for the better? That's complicated, as they say. I would argue that what's really meaningful here are a couple of things. First of all, if you look purely at numbers, I like to think like Tom Cruise, that whenever you do research or what's a good film, you should follow the money. And the same goes here. If you look at US elections, you have to look at campaign financing. Now, first look at ratings. Those are the eye pairs. And in the case of Democrats, there is now a serious issue: will Mrs. Clinton be able to hold her majority? Most people think that she will. If that's the case, we'll have probably more of the same in the next, in her first term. If Mr. Sanders were to win, then things will change. I would argue that perhaps for the better. Because here we have a candidate that is not dependent on PAC money, on big private philanthropy. Most of his monies come from individual donations of $25. But it would also have a lot of implications in terms of international trade and investment, which may be more complicated to emerging economies. Mr. Sanders is not very interested in offshoring in that regard. Mrs. Clinton says that she's not, but she really is, because Citibank is behind her, and you can't but be interested. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but there is a perception that the Wall Street is strongly behind Mrs. Clinton. Now, when you look at the Republican side, it gets even more interesting. A lot of people thought that Mr. Trump would not carry the vote, but he just might. And if you look at the ratings right now, it's quite clear that he will win the nomination, unless there's a real surprise. And it's been a very smart campaign. He hasn't used big buck money because he doesn't need it, but he hasn't really used his own money either too much. He has used the media by giving them what they want. And that's extraordinary. A big mistake on the part of the media, I would argue, but nonetheless it has worked for him very well. What it means is that the traditional, multilateral, middle-of-the-road Republican approach is now over. You don't have it. You don't have Mitch McConnell from the Senate telling people what should be the right road. You do not certainly have Kissinger here. When Kissinger traveled to meet Mr. Putin and they were trying to find a common line, he got himself marginalized in the American foreign policy discussion. And my concern would be that behind all of the players except Sanders, if you look at their foreign policy advisors, they're very close to the so-called conservative line. And that has a lot of very difficult implications internationally. What about Eurozone? Here again you have elusive stability, but it's based on quantitative easing. You do have cyclical rebound, but elevated risks. Some people are now very excited, most of my friends in Europe, because there is a real momentum in Germany and Spain. But let's be real about this. Germany is now growing barely by 1% per year. They used to grow 3-4% or so. The reason that they are growing is because they have been very smart. They rely on emerging economies and US. But US doesn't absorb exports as it used to, nor does China. Exactly. So here you have something of a problem. They can no longer have the kind of growth they used to have, and their population is actually declining. Without the immigration that many people seem to have a problem with in Europe, they would have even more problems. I perceive the time when the Europeans will start paying for the immigrants to come, rather than fighting those inflows. You need new population. It's good for the country. But of course it can't. It would be ideally skilled immigration. It's a two-way street. And I think that this is just, since it happens so very fast, it's bringing out the best and worst in Europe. That's what we see today. The growth in the short term is barely 1%. It could rise under good terms in the medium term to 1.7, but then it will decelerate down to maybe 1%. And here we don't have time for crises and reasons and rhymes, but I do want to pay attention to something here. Since 2010, I've argued that the European crisis is not going to go away. Every time there was one solution, now we have liquidity. I would say that's part of the solution, it's not all of the solution, it's not going to go away. And I draw myself a blueprint. If you resolve all those problems, perhaps the European crisis might go away. You would have to have adequate fiscal adjustment. You would have to have a move from monetary tightening to easing. That has happened. You would have to overcome all central bank challenges. Some of them have been overcome, not all. You would have to overcome all insolvency threats. Many of them have been resolved for now, but not all the way. Liquidity support, you would need it. That they do have. There is a firewall, but is it big enough for a really big crisis? That I wouldn't be sure of. Banking crisis, there should be recapitalization. To some degree this has happened, but not all the way. Biggest problems, competitiveness and innovation. The average R&D per Eurozone GDP is now about 2%. China's is about the same. China is investing into R&D more or the same as the Eurozone. But look at the living standards in Europe and look at the living standards in China. Something has got to give in. You cannot have high living standards without high productivity, high innovation. What Europeans are now doing under duress, understandably, and policymakers say that we don't have too many alternatives, perhaps they are right. But they will lose those living standards. But it will happen like in the poem of T.S. Eliot, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Slowly erosion. And I think that there's a reason for that, why it's the same way in certain regions, certain countries, because politicians don't like suicide. So if you propose policies that would actually be good ones, you might be voted out. And you rationalize that that's not good for the country because the country needs me. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe he should be a transformative politician. Many of us thought Obama, Mr. President Obama might be one of those. All of us were proved wrong. Not really bad, but not so great either in effectiveness, perhaps, in the end. So here we have a problem. Those problems, in other words, those old Eurozone problems still exist. But now you have a host of new ones. What about United Kingdom and their so-called Brexit? Will they or will they not stay? Will the marriage end or not? If they leave, Scotland might leave the UK. Catalonia is already making moves in that direction in Spain. We saw what happened to the pound sterling just the past 2 days. We'll see a lot more of that before June 23rd when the referendum will take place. Then there's the whole question of the future of city, financial centre in London. That's the reason why Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, says that actually we should leave EU. His mandate is London, not UK. And London would like to keep the benefits, the perks that it has. It's a very high-stake game. Then there's the issue of immigrant crisis. Many people thought it would go away soon. It's not going to go away. It's it's going to continue. I would argue that honestly it's partly because of the policies deployed. If you engage in military intervention in the northern Africa to Middle East, you're bound to have a backlash at some point, and then people can't take it, they leave. They don't want to leave. None of us would like to leave our home. People who pay remittances here, I'm sure would love to stay here if there was a good job, that they would feel comfortable, they would feel secure. People don't want to leave, not to speak of a military conflict. And then, because of the immigrant flows, now we have right-wing extremism and so on and so forth. That's getting worse in many areas, even in Germany. Alternative Germany now has maybe 10-15% of support. Used to be 2 to 3. Marine Le Pen in France, if there were elections today, Hollande wouldn't have a chance. Socialists would be voted out. Front National would come in. Simple as that. It may well happen next year. Would it be very bad for Europe? There I tend to disagree. Not necessarily so. When people get to the government, they have to make compromises, including these groups. But how far would they go? That we don't know. Then you have geopolitical tensions, the Syrian civil war, Russia, Ukraine, Russia, and so on and so forth. All of which will get worse, maybe get worse before they get any better. Then Japan. Here you could spend a lot of time talking about the quantitative easing, Abenomics, and so on and so forth. I won't do it. I will just give you the summary, which is that the short-term growth will be less than, will be probably close to 0 or 0.5 this year. At best, in the medium term, perhaps 1.4% by the end of this year, annualized. But then it will decline to less than 1% by early 2020s. That is a far stretch from where it used to be. And perhaps the most, from the point of view of the international economy, and also from the point of view of cooperation between Japan and the Philippines, I would pay very much attention to the fact that while there was a great effort to develop inflation, to reinforce it, we haven't seen it. On the contrary, the inflation has moved towards disinflation or deflation. There's nothing that seems to indicate the reverse. But there is one big change which started towards 2015 in October, when the government pension investment fund controls about $1.2 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, reduced funds in domestic bonds while pumping up investments in stocks. Now they control the investment funds of 67 million Japanese. If they succeed, great for those whose funds are involved. If not, then it's going to be very problematic. In other words, Japan is taking the kind of risk. It is perhaps in relative terms 3 times as high as the risk in the Federal Reserve at the peak of its quantitative easing or the Eurozone. So how this will turn out, taking into consideration Japan's significant role in Asia and Japan's development aid to many countries in the region. Every time I go to Myanmar, I ask my friends, how do you feel about this? And they always are very kind and polite, say that when you don't have too many alternatives, you're happy with what you've got. Maybe so, but they too are concerned in terms of the future because they just happen to be very dependent. Just on the right-hand side is the median Bank of Japan projection for inflation in the year ending March 2016. Let's remember that when Abenomics began, the whole point was to sort of hike it up towards 2%. What we see is precisely the reverse with all the methods that have been used. Sometimes I feel that when if you take a very simple parable, if you hit your head on the wall trying to open the door and it doesn't open, you may have to try something else. And here you start wondering something similar. That's crude and cruel and it shouldn't be that way. But there's so much at stake in this for ordinary Japanese that it pains not to use a very strong metaphor about that. What about China? Huge changes in the past 2 years. When the present leadership came in, I think I was one of the few foreign observers who in China, Hong Kong, and elsewhere in the region and in the US actually thought that these are reformers and that they are tough reformers. Having lived in China, I know one thing. If you want to have reforms, you better be tough. That is a big nation. And the further you are from Beijing, the less you pay attention to Beijing. Witness Chongqing. and what happened there not so long ago, Hu Xilai and his rule. How much there's politics in this we can argue, but what we might all agree upon is that things are now dramatically different in China. A lot of Western countries felt the pain in 2008, 2009. Now the Chinese are beginning to feel uneasy. But if you go to Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, or elsewhere, and you want to have a nice place, have great dim sum in the weekend, you still have to fight for your seat. People are more value conscious, they're cost conscious, they spend more wisely, but it's not like the end of the world yet. Depends also where you are. If you are in provinces that were highly dependent on export-driven growth, you're taking a deep hit. If not, then not. The short-term growth probably is around 6.5 to 6.9% in official terms. By that, I'm not one of those who say that all the data is mistaken or distorted coming from China, because I simply don't believe in that. I do believe that if you disaggregate the economic growth data and look at it from the point of view of industrial sectors, you will find out that what looks to be 6.9% is closer to 6.5. And I tend to go with the 6.5. That's probably closer to where we are. Now, long term, assuming that the problems can be overcome, I do believe that we could have growth of 4 to 5% for still years to come. A lot less than it used to be, not double-digit growth, but a hell of a lot faster than we see in the advanced economies. And what is going on here is a major change. During the first years of the crisis, because of the stimulus package that was launched in China, you could have a situation where you talked a lot about change, but you didn't have it. Instead, you had leverage, you had a huge stimulus package, much of it did not go filter down to SMEs or for inclusive growth, if you will, but for speculation, for property markets. Created a huge hangover at the local level, not at the central level. China's central government debt is relatively low, less than 20%, but at the local level. And that's the hangover that people are dealing with. And reforms were deferred. Now when Li Keqiang, the present Prime Minister, came in, and by the way, he wrote his own dissertation of the economic restructuring in China, so he has a perfect chance to implement those conclusions that he had. He wanted to have deleverage, a mini-stimulus, and structural reforms. These 3 points were not his doctrine, but de facto this is what he was doing. But even he had to swallow these words a little bit. Okay, we won't have a maxi stimulus, but we will have targeted stimulus packages, because otherwise the situation got pretty dicey, so you had to have some kind of growth and inspire and incite it. He had to give in certain areas as well. But what China is doing is deleveraging, and China is doing structural reforms. US could, but doesn't. Europe says it has a plan, but isn't really using it because it can't. Japan says it has a plan, but more and more people, including some Japanese, are losing their faith in it. So that's a curious situation when you look at the situation from different angles. If you look at what is going on currently in China, and I recently brought a piece in that came out China Daily, I believe today, that was about what people now call shikonomics. It's a fancy term, like Reaganomics and so on and so forth. It was created by People's Daily a couple of weeks back, and I don't see anything bad about that. It gives you a shorthand what policies try to be, aspire to be. But the 4 comprehensives are really the key. In other words, the strategic goal is and remains building a moderately prosperous society. And that means that middle income, not Western-style middle income, that ain't going to happen. Middle income Chinese, with Chinese characteristics, if you will. And that's not a bad life. This is the objective, and that means that the GDP per capita figures will be doubled from 2010 to 2020. That is very important in China. If you fail doing that, a lot of people will have a problem. But I think that the government just may succeed in it. How will it do it? You need structural reforms, you need rule of law, and you need strict discipline in the party. A lot of people say that, well, we've heard so much about, reform or corruption in China, but it isn't happening. I argued when the new leadership came in that now it will happen. I remember when Xi Jinping gave a speech in the party school in Beijing. I've taught in the party school in Shanghai, but not in Beijing. I only visited there. But he gave a speech half a year before he took his office where he said, he gave that famous warning to tigers and flies who will come after you. And people didn't take it seriously. That was at their own peril. It was meant. And ordinary Chinese like it. But everybody is a bit uneasy, so how far this will continue? Now we have an answer. It will continue as long as it takes. When Wang Quishan became the anti-corruption czar, that was relevant. That's why I thought that this would be serious. This is the man who was in charge of the strategic and economic dialogue with the United States. He was the mayor of Beijing, and he got that position where there were a lot of problems with the Olympic organization. He took over. When the former Secretary of Treasury met him in Beijing, he gave him one of the helmets of the New York Fire Department. And the reason is that Mr. Wang Quishan is known kind of a fire patrol chief. He goes where he's needed, and he delivers. So he's now behind this, and those reforms are absolutely needed for anti-corruption. Now, you had the examples of Singapore and Hong Kong, and they have learned a lot of those, and they are implementing it. But let's be real. Singapore, 3, 4 million, 4, 5. Hong Kong, 7 million. China, 1.3 billion. It's different. It's more complex, and it's tougher. And that also means the same approach within the party. Structural reforms is the most important thing. If there is laxness in structural reforms, a lot of the objectives simply won't happen. It's absolutely necessary. And it will be problematic. I'll give you just one example. State-owned enterprises and their reforms. Now, at this point in time, most Chinese companies that are going abroad to the US, where do they have most of their mergers and acquisitions? Advanced manufacturing. Because they want to compete with the best in the world. It's no longer going to be the cheap prices of China, but the innovation of China. So you have to be innovative. Now, will that knowledge stay in the US? Of course not. It will be transferred to China. And there you have a problem. Now you start implementing advanced manufacturing that's more capital intensive than labor intensive in your own country. What about the people in state-owned enterprises? I'm not one of those who feel, like many of my friends do in the US, that, well, they should be fired. That's easy to say, but this is not Silicon Valley, and we are not talking about people who have basic social security. You cannot do that. It hasn't worked anywhere in Europe or Japan or even in the US where people have tried to implement it. You don't want to have a Detroit. You want to have a New York City, perhaps. So here we have very serious issues in terms of the more open you become, the more exposed you become. This was the example that Dr. Ballesteros mentioned earlier. The more open you become, the more exposed you become. 2008, when China was in the middle of thinking about financial reforms, and there were all kinds of panels about it, I was the only one who was not so crazy about them. I came from New York City. I knew that there would be a serious crisis, and it would happen relatively soon. So what do you want to do? You want to have Citibank, Morgan Stanley, Chase, all of them coming to China without constraints, doing what they have done in Florida, in Nevada? My God, no. You want to have them clean their mess first and then perhaps internationalize gradually. An example that I would think would be pertinent to many countries in Asia. Nothing against any kind of firms, but financial sector has now a lot of issues that have to be taken very seriously. So I was one of those who felt that perhaps you should gradually liberalize that sector. And if you go too fast, you may pay for it dearly. We have a lot of examples in Asia that tell us what happens when you do go too fast. So when it comes to China, I feel that you will have an example of, you will not have a hard landing, and you are not having a hard landing right now. The typical signs of hard landing, central bank hiking up rates, isn't happening. The POBC has been cutting rates. You don't have rising inflation in China. You have actually sort of steady inflation. It's not disinflation per se, but it could go there under some circumstances. You don't have recession. You are still growing relatively well. And most importantly, China could grow faster if it wanted to. Thank God it doesn't. Because you're now at the point where you want to have secular change. You want to have transform your structures. You cannot go to the next level without it. And business cycles and their problems are a typical example of hard landing. And this is why I feel that you still have relatively good room for growth in China. But what has happened, and this is relevant to world at large and to Asia, China can no longer bail out global growth. That happened during the last crisis. China at one point, at the toughest stage, accounted 50% of global growth. No longer possible. Merely the role of the population of China and the GDP of China as part of the total world GDP is smaller. Today, China accounts maybe 25% of world GDP growth. That's more realistic. And I think the Chinese would be first to say this, that look, you know, we don't want to tell others how to live their life because we have enough issues here trying to make things last and sustained and avoid issues. I also believe that should China be able to implement those reforms, they will enjoy a reform dividend within 2 or 3 years. It won't be a major change, but instead of having steady decline, steady deceleration, you have a little growth bump for a year or two, which would be hoped for. Finally, Saudi Arabia. I thought for a few years that Saudi Arabia is living on a borrowed time, and I think that the situation has got worse in the past 1 or 2 years. This is naturally problematic for a country like Philippines, where so many people are working in the region. And the question is, can these issues be dealt with in a manner where the growth will still be sustained in Saudi Arabia, where they would be able to avoid further military confrontation, not just in Syria but Yemen and elsewhere, and thereby focus on economic development as they have in the past. If they have serious problems, a lot of Middle Eastern countries will feel it. Egypt is entirely dependent on aid and assistance and whatever name you want to call it, military economic cooperation, based on Saudi Arabia and the rest. The growth will decelerate this year to about 2.3%, could remain around 3 to 3.5% until early 2020s, assuming, and that's a big assumption, that the oil prices gradually will start growing, and assuming that Riyadh will be able to avoid further military deterioration of its position in the region and elsewhere. Key problem here really is the oil price. I'm publishing a long story about this that should be coming out today or tomorrow, and I will give it to you afterwards, but let's just put it this way. I don't see any major reversal in oil prices. I think that we will, at best, in 2 years' time, have 35 to 40% dollars per barrel Brent crude oil. And that means that it's not the big change that many people hope for. And I'm very cognizant of the implications. Tell me another time in the post-war history where so many developing countries, emerging economies, transition economies that are oil and energy exporters have had to deal with the price that's so low. We can find some of those times, but with the assumption that soon it will become more positive, the prices will go up. But now we don't see it. There's the US shale gas revolution. China still needs a lot of oil. It is a mistake to argue that because of China's deceleration, this oil demand is going down. It's not. It's 8.5%. So that's not the reason. I would argue it has a lot more to do with the geopolitics of the region and military objectives, perhaps, and sphere of influence or interference ideas. Nonetheless, there are also a lot of problematic issues that have to do with the succession in Saudi Arabia, and many observers find it hard to understand why things go the way they do. In other words, King Salman has acceded to the throne since January 2015, but he named his nephew, Interior Minister Mohammed bin Nayef, as a crown prince, whereas his own son, Defense Minister Mohammed bin Salman, to deputy crown prince. And there's a fear of confrontation, contest even, in that regard. From the Filipino point of view, if that's making you uneasy, perhaps it should. What about then the regional aspects? I do want to wind down and so that we can talk a bit more, and I apologize for taking too much time, but I will just mention the key points and we can talk about them afterwards. If you look at and sort of get together what we've talked about, the growth drivers and how they're slowing, how does this reflect globally and regionally? Globally, point one, it means that there will be persistent stagnation in advanced economies. The kind of growth that used to be there in the past is not there right now and won't be there in the future. It will be slower. I might go as far, and I know that most of you wouldn't believe me, but that the kind of a growth plunge that we saw in 1973-74 in Europe with advanced economies, we're dealing with something of that nature here, where the growth potential might even be cut by 30 to 50%. And that makes things very rough for those countries that are looking for a catch-up. They want to catch up with the living standards of the West, at least to a significant degree, including the Philippines. Second, monetary divergence. We see all kinds of policies by central banks to deal with this kind of situation. The furthest example, of course, is the Bank of Japan here on the left-hand picture, that line going all the way up. Their debt is now, sovereign debt is 250% of GDP, close to it. If they continue incrementally without major changes, negative or positive, in the next, by 2040 it will be 400% of GDP. That cannot happen. That cannot happen. It's here where I start thinking of Jim Rogers, the famous commodity trader I met in Singapore, and he says that he's just waiting for the avalanche. As does Soros. They used to work together, by the way. And they too tend to short industries and countries when it's in their interest to do so. And that's pretty scary from the point of view of those countries. And I think that the solution in Japan is not just the monetary easing. There are other issues that should matter as well. But the most important for us and for Philippines will be the Fed. What will they do? Initially, the argument was that, well, the Fed may have 4 hikes this year. Now, perhaps real consensus should be 2. And the next, perhaps, in the first quarter. May not happen. May not happen in March. Could happen in June. Also, may happen earlier. Who says it has to happen in March or June? Or that it would happen has to happen in a certain day on a certain month? Can happen in an interim. Has happened in the past when there's been a very serious situation. I think that these are the options being investigated by the Fed right now. They take this situation to be that severe, potentially. So they want to have all approaches open to themselves in this situation. I often contribute and cooperate with Rubini Global. Rubini is a famous economist, one of those who saw the crisis coming in advance, well in advance, 2008, already 2005 and 6. And last time I talked with him, he was exactly of the same opinion. He says that, and he knows the people in question, that gradually they've changed their views. People were very gung-ho about a year ago still, not anymore. It's a different world. There's also something that none of us are talking about. There were actually $4 trillion involved with quantitative easing. Now what happens to that money? Every central bank should think about this. And some people are now arguing that that may become a new policy tool in the future. Now how do you use it in the future? That will be very interesting. It's not just a question of very low interest rates, but also all those funds. How will they be dealt with in the future? And in particular, how will the Fed deal with it? The good story, I think, from the point of view of Philippines and emerging economies is that even though the US has no mandate to pay any attention to emerging economies, and I would argue that it really hasn't most of the time, at least you have central bankers at the top right now who really understand the problem of internationalization, who understand that the decisions that they make have serious economic implications worldwide. The same goes for her second-hand in command, Mr. Stanley Fischer. Now the third trend, the emerging market growth will simply be below potential. And those countries that are dependent on energy sales, oil, natural gas, commodities, will take a heavy hit. They will suffer a lot more. And those countries who may or may not have the dependencies vis-a-vis energy, but do have dollar-denominated debt, are also in for trouble in this kind of situation. When you have less growth and the pie is smaller and the liabilities are higher, it's a very uneasy equation for all of us. Plunge of commodities, that's very rough for most emerging economies, developing economies even more so, because they are taking the hit. And naturally, oil is the biggest problem in this regard. Market volatility, a lot of us talk about Shanghai, and perhaps we should. It's trial and error. But honestly, I am concerned about what happens in Shanghai and do follow it. I remember last mid-June when I flew from Shanghai to New York City. Prior to that, I went to bank, and the analysts there were telling me that we are now at the eve of the golden era. Things will only get better. The stock market will only go up from here. And I don't like to argue with people. I turned around, my wife asked, so what happened? I said, oh, it's irrational inexuberance again, deja vu. Greenspan talking. And when that happens, you better restructure your fund. It couldn't last. It had to come down because it had been too far up too fast. But it has a lot of potential to go, that market. That would do believe it. But with China, they all forget one simple thing. 80% of the investors are retail investors, individuals. 20% institutions. Unless you have institutions, you will have a lot of volatility in the markets. It comes with the territory. And most people who invest, honestly, even though every time I see something on CNN, BBC, I see mom and pop standing in front of the stock market window, that's not the case. They are nouveau riche. They may belong to the party. They want to speculate. They sometimes are students from Fudan in Shanghai business school, where some of the kids thought that they know how to do corporate finance and lost most of the money they were supposed to use for their tuition in the past 2 years. Bad lesson, but hopefully something you learn from. The historical memory isn't there. I'm far more concerned about this, the US market. Schiller, who got the Nobel not so long ago, has been talking about the fact that the US market and some other Western markets is hugely overvalued. And he argues on the basis of the price per earnings, PE, cyclically adjusted. Now, it gets pretty interesting if you look very carefully at that picture, because where the US is now is of course not as high as it is 2000 and 1981, but it's close to 1966 when there was a deep drop, or 1901. And the average point there is 27, the Cape ratio. It should really be closer to, what is it, 13, 18, somewhere there. It's hugely overvalued. Now, out of curiosity, I looked what it should be if the ratio would be correct. Then the marketplace, the Dow Jones should be 11,000. Simple as that. Well, none of us think that it will go so much down, but it's certainly too high up. And it's based on the fact that we ignore the great debt US has because we think that the foreign investors have a great incentive to invest there. Perhaps. But I think that we should take this seriously. Then there's the issue of currency turmoil, what might happen in this regard, and the dollar going up, other currencies going down. But look at the dollar index historically. We've seen these periods of dollar go up. We saw it in early 80s. We saw it again in around the internet years. But each time it has gone up, it's relatively less than in the past. So yes, dollar is going up, but it's not any longer as strong as it used to be, not as solid, not so full. There's also a new player in this game, and that is the renminbi. If you look at the SDR composition of the IMF, that will be by October 2016 10% of the total, or 11% of the total. US dollar will remain the same, almost 42%. The Europeans took a hit. That will be significantly less than it used to be. And that means that the value of renminbi will be a significant actor in the currency struggles in the future. And naturally people are concerned about that, particularly now that capital has been moving out from China. Then there's the extreme weather phenomena. Are these getting better or worse? From the point of Philippines, worse. And when Philippines, according to some indicators, is very close to the top of the risk index, I think this is something that should be taken very seriously and more seriously in the future, not just with the long-term approach, with the short-term approach, but the medium and long-term approach. There was a Paris Accord, but I'm one of those who believe that our views of the 2 Celsius increase from the pre-industrial level is mistaken. It won't be as easy to absorb even 2 Celsius as many people think. Those of you who may have studied James Hansen's publications, he was the first one to testify about this 1988. He argues that it's a huge fallacy that we've taken that 2 Celsius seriously. Whether we can even reach that level, that question remains. More likely it is that we won't. He was in Paris and argued that that was more rhetoric but not really solutions. I'm a bit more optimistic because I think that when things get more serious, people make more serious decisions, but unless and until they do, it will be more of the same. And finally, the century that we're living in is the most violent since the 20th century. There are now 60 million people who are globally displaced, higher than at any point of time since the Second World War. So to argue like happens in the West, I find myself outraged at times when I'm in Europe or in the US and people talk about the serious problems of immigration in Europe. It's serious, yes, for Europeans. But let's be real. Most of these immigrants, Pakistan, Turkey, countries that have so little and simply can't take care of this. Jordan, my God. And we know that this will only get worse. The more you have geopolitical objectives and friction, the more you will have global forced displacement. Now, if you look at how these will turn regionally, Asia-Pacific, very simple, weakening recovery. The numbers won't be as high as before. ASEAN integration, sure, it will proceed. It's very good for the region. I remember the time when the Europeans used to smile at ASEAN. When I met Mr. Koh, who was working on the ASEAN Charter in Singapore a couple of years back, he used to talk about this and said, well, you know, they were very critical in the past, but now it seems that they would like to emulate what we have done. And I think there's a real lesson here. When you're dealing with a very diverse region with very different levels of economic development, you shouldn't have straight jackets. One size does not fit all, and there's a lot to be learned from ASEAN. Nonetheless, there's great competition and uncertainty relating to the free trade agreements. If you look at the risk element, China's slowdown or deceleration, as I would call it, China's deceleration, growth deceleration, and Fed policy are the biggest uncertainties. But Philippines will be hit more, if it will be hit by the Fed policy, than China, and that's a reason it has to do with the less involvement in this regard. Many people think that it's a good thing in Philippines. I don't. I think that there should be more cooperation with China, more economic cooperation. I think it's possible. One reason for it is the outgoing Chinese capital. Then there's this whole issue of US and Chinese rebalancing in Asia-Pacific. I think that when Mr. Obama created his pivot to Asia, the Chinese started working a lot in rebalancing their role in the region as well. You knew that there would be friction. It's simply impossible not to have it. Every time you've had a major regional hegemon, there has been friction between the power that's declining and the power that's rising. The question is, can you manage it the way it happened between the UK and US? But these countries were, they had more in the fundamental connected than China, which is so much different from the US in that regard. But I tend to be optimistic only for economic reasons. When both countries have so much to lose, since they are now so much in the symbiotic relationship, perhaps that keeps them calm. 5. Chinese capital. I think this is a very important trend, and I think that this is underestimated in the Philippines. Two parts of it, the internal and the regional. The internal being the fact that the Chinese capital is now coming out. It's not just foreign capital coming in, but Chinese capital going out. And when you look at where it's going, if we had better fonts, bigger fonts, and you would look at the picture all the way to the right up, you will find Vietnam. Pretty nice billions going to Vietnam, but not the Philippines. Why? Vietnam has a bone to pick with the territorial issues. Even Chinese probably don't take it very seriously anymore when they send party leaders to Beijing when they make a contested move in the region, thinking that the old party affiliation can diffuse tensions. Nonetheless, Vietnam and other countries that have territorial friction with China have been able to separate the negotiations on the economic policies and the territorial issues. And I think that would be very important for these two countries, China and Philippines, both of which I spend much of my time. But when you look at the situation with the other part of it, the oval, or the one road, one belt, this is even more important. It hasn't been taken seriously enough. Look at the cooperation between Indonesia and China right now, and how far it might go in the long run. Here we have an example of Chinese capital going out. Of course, it's very much in the Chinese interest. There's a lot of overcapacity as well. They can scale it out this way, but it can be very helpful for countries in the region, and it can accelerate their industrialization. This is my greatest hope in the Middle East. Despite my great regard for the United States, I think that a lot of the Middle East policies have been so flawed. Regime change is no solution. It has created great destabilization from the 1949, when the Syrian elections were overthrown, and the democratic leadership, to the present, to the Iraqi war, and then the Afghanistan war, Pakistani war, and to the present. There have been so many wars, it's hard to remember them or recall them one after another. Chinese economic development, as it is part of the OBO, is moving to the Middle East. And the question is, can you do this? Can you have negotiations between the Iranians and the Saudis at the same time? It was very important, I think, to observe that when Mr. Xi Jinping was there, he went to Egypt, he went to Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it was for a reason. I think that behind the facades we see constantly efforts to try to find economic development as the lowest common denominator that would unite all these parties. But it's becoming increasingly difficult because there are very different interests in this region. The struggle for free trade in Asia Pacific that led to TPP, US-led TPP, that Philippines is not yet part, arguments being made that, well, we should be part of it because it can make us more competitive. Other argument being, let's be part of it, but not quite as yet. If we will do that, it may hurt us when we're still growing from a very low position. Okay, Vietnam is part of it, great, even lower per capita incomes, but they will always be happy with that solution. They will also have to use suppliers that will be more expensive in the future. Do we want to have that? When the Indians were talking about this, I'm cooperating with one of their think tanks, and I argue that for Indians it would be very important to follow closely what happens, but not joining yet, for the same reason that I think applies to the Philippines. But in the long run, yes. For China, this is obviously very difficult. Whatever my American colleagues will say in the White House or elsewhere, that, well, you should join TPP. China feels it's part of the containment policy. And I understand that. If your leadership is being tapped by the NSA 24 hours, 365 days a year after the Snowden disclosures, as Putin said, we all are amateurs next to that. And he used to work for their secret police, secret service for quite a long time. In other words, others simply don't have the same capabilities. And that is a concern on the Chinese side. But so be it. Everybody is doing that right now. The question is, can we manage these differences in some meaningful way? My hunch is that China will push more and more the old idea of FDAAP, which actually Fred Bergsten, the former leader, chairman of what used to be called the Peterson Institute, introduced years ago, the idea that there should be really a large free trade agreement where both China and the US would have a role. And I think it makes sense. My American friend would say that, look, that's a nice idea, but TPP is pretty far. Why don't we finish this first and then go to the next stage? And Chinese friends will say, well, that's kind of self-serving, isn't it? Because it seems to work with you and it has geopolitical interest. It's not really an economic deal. Be that as it may, that's the way it is. Then there's a question around inward FDI. The biggest problem from the point of view of the Philippines, should there be greater volatility in the near future, because Philippines doesn't get what it should. And part of the reason is naturally the issue of control and the existing legislation and perhaps the objectives of the present administration to keep the constitution separate from other objectives. Why not? I think that you could have had both perhaps. I think that we should have moved ahead faster because it's not just that we're not getting enough, but we're losing the good years of FDI development. They're gone, they won't come back. So now you have to work twice as hard for twice as little perhaps. And when Philippines still, although the numbers have gradually been going up, is still behind, it's not a good sign, although I think that it will change and it will change for the better. And then there's a whole issue of regional geopolitical tensions. And one question, and recall the fact that I'm emphasizing medium term and long term. When the pivot was created by Mr. President Obama, he was behind, and Vice President Biden. And naturally, you had President Aquino and Mr. Rosado in the foreign ministry for understandable reasons for pushing and supporting these objectives. But now we're going to live in a very different world very soon. Now, Mr. Aquino won't be there, Mr. Rosado won't be there, Mr. Obama is out, Mr. Biden is out. We do know that Mr. Xi Jinping will be there. Wang Yi will be there. He's the one who traveled to Washington to explain what is going on in the region. But who will be on the other side? That's a big question mark. If Mr. Trump, for instance, decides to implement what he said he would, in other words, 45% tariff against China, that won't be only against China. It would be against other low-cost nations, as he would call them. And that would hurt quite a few emerging economies. Will he pull it out? I think that he's a deal maker, as he says he is, but it would be a lot of uncertainty at the time when the world is so incapable of dealing with uncertainty. So, here we are. The official picture is that the advanced economies, G7, are feeling better. They are becoming bigger and so on and so forth. The BRICS, emerging economies, suffer from a slowdown. That's partly an optical illusion. Either for the best, and we don't understand why IMF shows these pictures that way. Because you really should look at the numbers the way they are. Here's the unofficial picture, or unofficial. If you look at the 4%, that is where the advanced economies are. So why you actually, don't adapt the font and the numbers as they should? Perhaps because emerging economies are now driving the world economy. And when the world institutions are still organized according to the victors of the Second World War, this is hard to deal with. I think that I'm all for AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank by China. I'm all for the BRICS Development Bank. I don't think that they are threats to IMF, World Bank. I don't think that there has been an emerging economy, multilateral financial institution yet. AIIB could evolve into one. BRICS Bank could evolve into one. There's room for more. The more the merrier. But there are fears regarding this, and they are reflected in the way we process and analyze information and data. Now, let's assume that the growth prospect globally will be 3%, muddling through. What have we learned here then? What is the sum in this case? We started from global growth prospects. I argue that there's a semblance of stability, not a real stability. We looked at the spillover channels, how these things could affect different countries. We saw diminished growth prospects in some of the most important economies of the world, particularly US, Eurozone, Japan, China, Saudi Arabia, all of which are important to, and from the point of view of the Philippines. We looked at the global economic themes which reflect how those uncertainties are now manifest. Persistent stagnation of the advanced economies, monetary divergence, the growth below potential in emerging economies, the plunge of commodities, the oil glut, market volatility in general, currency turmoil, extreme weather phenomena, global force displacement. Then we looked at the regional implications. Weakening recovery in Asia-Pacific, ASEAN integration works against it to some degree, but is not a full cushion either. China slowdown or deceleration, Fed's rate hikes, US-China rebalancing, Chinese capital going out, FDI, OBOR, one road, one belt, struggle for free trade in Asia-Pacific if geopolitical friction can be avoided. Inward FDI, which is the one area where the Philippines is way behind others in a way that's no longer justified. Regional geopolitical tensions, which could get worse with the next administration in the US. And we could have looked also at the outlooks of several ASEAN governments. As a result of that, it's only understandable when you look at the future, the growth prospects have been downgraded, and we see diminished global growth in the near term. So we are left with three scenarios. In the best case, we are muddling through these crises, in which case nobody wins, but nobody really loses big time. And that means global growth that will probably be closer to 3% than Mrs. Lagarde would like to acknowledge yet. And second, another alternative that would be better would be growth acceleration that would hike up the growth rate to 4%. I don't see it coming for the reasons mentioned